There are many things about the Xenobots are surprising. One of the surprising things, which you just mentioned, is that actually these frog cells are not genetically modified. They are just normal frog cells taken from a frog egg. And we were all taught in school that frog DNA encodes a frog and human DNA encodes a human. But it seems, thanks to the Xenobots, that that's not quite true. Whatever the genes are doing, whatever frog DNA is doing, it allows frog cells to be rearranged into a new shape and a new form that is very, very different from a frog.
Thank you for joining the Change I Am Possible, which is India's first Future Tech Meets Sustainability podcast. Today, I'm delighted and honored to have with me Dr. Josh Bongard, whose research centers on evolutionary robotics, evolutionary computation, and physical simulation. He runs the Morphology, Evolution, and Cognition Laboratory, whose work focuses on the role that morphology and evolution play in cognition. In 2007, he was awarded a prestigious Microsoft Research New Faculty Fellowship and was named one of MIT Technology Review's top 35 young innovators under 35. In 2010, he was awarded a Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers by ex-President Barack Obama. So Dr. Josh, it's a complete pleasure and honor to have you on the show. You are building a Xenobot. So I want to get into that, but why don't we start by explaining what is evolutionary robotics, evolutionary computation, and physical simulation? And what is it that you can, what are its capabilities? What can it achieve?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to describe that. First of all, Eddie, thank you so much for having me on your show. I look forward to our chat. So you asked me about evolutionary robotics, evolutionary computation, and physics simulation. So let's start with evolutionary robotics. We're all familiar with robots. Maybe some of your audience members have a iRobot vacuum, a Roomba vacuum cleaner at home. We kind of know what robots are. Hollywood has showed us good and evil robots. In reality, the way that robots are usually made is an engineering company like Boston Dynamics here in the US. They build the body of the robot. They take metal and ceramics, plastics, electronics, sensors, motors, batteries, and they design a way to put all of those pieces together to make the robot. Then they turn that robot over to an AI, and that AI programs or trains the brain of that robot to do whatever we want the robot to do. That is not how Mother Nature works. That is not how evolution produced all the species we have on Earth, including us. Mother Nature does not create a body and then tinker with the brain. The evolutionary process guides or gently sculpts or changes body and brain together. So in evolutionary robotics, what we do is we write a piece of computer code called an evolutionary algorithm. And we let that evolutionary algorithm or evolutionary computation, we let it loose inside a computer where we connect that evolutionary algorithm with the physics engine. This is the physical simulation part. So a physics engine, if you played a modern video game, it's exactly that. It's the metaverse. It's a virtual world inside the computer. And what the evolutionary algorithm does is it creates a virtual robot inside that virtual world, and then watches what that virtual robot does and assigns a score based on whatever we want the robot to do. If it does a better job at what we want it to do, that robot produces randomly modified copies of itself. It produces child robots that are similar to but not identical to the parent robot. And the virtual robots that do not do such a good job at what we want them to do, the computer deletes those virtual robots. And it repeats this process millions, billions, trillions of times until eventually the evolutionary algorithm evolves a virtual robot that does what we want it to do. We then take that robot and send it to our robotics colleagues, where they use 3D printers and other manufacturing facilities to build a physical version of that evolved robot. And in some cases, that physical robot does what the evolutionary algorithm thought that it would do. That's how we evolve robots in the field of evolutionary robotics.
Lovely. How cool is this marriage of understanding things in a simulation and helping it evolve? Intelligent itself is emergent. We don't really know whether that could be the way into creating intelligent machines. Now, while you are at it, would you like to also explain morphology, evolution in Cognition Laboratory?
Absolutely. Yeah. The name of my lab is a little bit of a mouthful: morphology, evolution, and cognition. We just talked about evolution, right? Evolution is complicated, but you can also boil it down to this very simple rule: make randomly modified copies of good things and delete not so good things. Very, very simple. Morphology in English is an old word, and it's a word that refers to all the physical parts of an animal or a human being. So in our case, morphology is pretty much everything else except the brain. And as I just mentioned when I was describing evolutionary robotics, in robotics, usually a human engineer builds the morphology, decides whether they're going to make a four-legged robot or a wheeled robot or a drone or a snake. They decide on the morphology. The problem with that is we don't know what the right morphology is, meaning if we want the robot to act intelligently or do something useful, we might think we know what the morphology should be, but often that's not the case. So in my lab and in evolutionary robotics, we try and automate the design of morphology. We let the evolutionary algorithm try out different morphologies: more legs, less legs, more snake-like, less snake-like, more wheels, less wheels, until it finds a body, a morphology, and a brain that when you put them together causes the robot to do what we want it to do.
Wow.
The last word in the name of my lab is cognition. And again, in English, cognition, it means different things to different people. It's actually a term that's difficult to define. Usually it means more complex intelligence. Things like playing chess, doing mathematics, using language, using tools. We're kind of biased. Usually cognition, it means the smart things that humans do that animals don't often or have never been observed to do, which I think says more about our bias than really our firm understanding of what intelligence is.
You are creating evolution of some sorts, and maybe the output is going to be a subspecies or completely different evolutionary species coming out of your lab. Now, you mentioned that robots, so far have been machine based. You mentioned Boston Dynamics doing some amazing thing with the robotics. Then there's these bio inspired robots doing some amazing things with really cool capabilities. But what you are building is a Xenobot. Would you mind explaining first of all what a Xenobot is?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I just also wanted to underline the fact that it's not just me making Xenobots or evolving robots. I'm like most scientists or engineers, I'm part of a team. So in the case of the Xenobots, the Xenobot team is made up of 4 members. There's myself, who's a computer scientist, Sam Kreigman, my graduate student, and we teamed up, us 2 computer scientists, we teamed up with 2 biologists, Mike Levin and Doug Blackistone. And Mike and Doug are biologists at Tufts University in Massachusetts here in the US. So 2 computer scientists, 2 biologists. And if we can rewind the tape a little bit to January 2020, at that time, the 4 of us received some funding from the US government to create lifelong learning machines. And to the government, a lifelong learning machine is, I guess, as the name implies, a machine that keeps getting smarter as it moves about in its world. At the moment, most robotics and AI, we try and train or program them in the lab and then let them loose in the world, let the autonomous car loose on our roads and sort of cross our fingers and hope for the best. But again, that's not how humans and animals learn. We learn on the go as we're acting. So the 4 of us got together and thought about how we could make lifelong learning machines. And we had a weekly Zoom call, the four of us. 1 week, us computer scientists showed to the biologists some of our virtual robots evolving in virtual worlds. And the next week on the Zoom call, Doug Blackistone, one of our biology colleagues, put up an image on the Zoom screen, which was, it was hard to tell what it was. It was something physical that looked like one of our evolved virtual robots. And Doug explained that he had been inspired the previous week by our virtual robots. He had taken a microscope. He had taken some frog skin cells from a very early frog embryo. So basically an egg that is on its way to becoming a tadpole, a baby frog. Took some of those skin cells, which are a little bit sticky. They're kind of like sticky Lego bricks. And he put them together in the shape of one of our virtual robots. And the moment that the four of us saw that Doug could build a version of our robots from frog cells, that's where the idea of Xenobots was born. A few months later, Doug figured out how to build heart muscle tissue into these, combine them with skin cells. And heart muscle tissue from the frog, these are cells that increase and decrease their size. They get bigger and smaller, which makes sense. Frog heart muscle tissue builds a heart that pumps blood in and out of the heart. If you rearrange those cells, they act like very small motors, or very small pistons. They kind of push and pull at the body of the Xenobot and cause it to start moving. So Doug was able to make a Xenobot sculpture out of skin cells which didn't move. Later, he was able to add in these heart muscle tissues, which caused the Xenobot to move. And that's how the Xenobot project was born.
Super exciting, but it's something which I'm unable to wrap my head around. When we, like for example, brain-computer interface, we people are trying to scan the entire cognitive, structural and functional capabilities and map it onto a computer. So they're mapping it as zeros and one, as code. So this is data. So here I get that, but because you are building a physical simulation which is code, how does the marriage happen? Is it are you genetically manipulating? The Doug is doing that. What's the process? Would you like to dig in this and explain this a little bit, please?
Yeah, you're not alone in having a hard time wrapping your mind around it. It's kind of a non-intuitive concept. There are many things about the Xenobots are surprising. One of the surprising things, which you just mentioned, is that actually these frog cells are not genetically modified. They are just normal frog cells taken from a frog egg. And we were all taught in school that frog DNA encodes a frog and human DNA encodes a human. But it seems, thanks to the Xenobots, that that's not quite true. Whatever the genes are doing, whatever frog DNA is doing, it allows frog cells to be rearranged into a new shape and a new form that is very, very different from a frog. So let me tell you about a Xenobot itself. It's, as I mentioned, it's a collection of frog cells taken from frog embryo. A Xenobot is about 1 millimeter in diameter. So if you looked into one of Doug's petri dishes, it's filled with fresh water because frogs like fresh water. And you'd see what look like specks of pepper, specks of black pepper moving around in that dish. Xenobots are just visible to the naked eye. So they're very, very small. And it turns out that if you take these cells and you rearrange it into a shape that is nothing like a frog, it's much, much smaller to begin with. Not only do those cells not die, but they stick together and they hold their shape. And some of those configurations, depending if you put those cells together in the right way, produce behavior. They'll start moving along the bottom of the petri dish. So that's a Xenobot. It's not code. It's not metal. It's not electronics. It's not a neural network. It's just frog tissue. But it's frog tissue that's been rearranged. And the question is, how do you come up with this arrangement? Where does the idea of which particular rearrangement to try come from? That comes from the computer. That comes from the evolutionary code that's trying out different combinations of simulated frog tissues inside a simulated petri dish, inside a simulated world. That's where the ideas for Xenobots come from. They come from an AI.
Right. So you are creating uh, the code onto the evolutionary computation. You're tinkering around with the cell, and it gives out the output is that this can possibly create life, and then Doug Blackistone tries it with the real frog tissue and the muscle tissue and the heart tissue, and eventually it starts producing behavior. Does it produce intellect? What are its capabilities? What does it do? And does this prove, because there's these panpsychists for the longest time have believed that all atoms have some kind of consciousness. Is that what's happening with, if you're saying tissues, cells just clunk together? Because these are different tissues, right? It's a skin cell, it's a heart cell. How do they kind of match up together? What's the marriage? How's that going on?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I like to consider myself a scientist. So I have to rely on observation, what we see. So I was just describing what you would see if you looked into one of Doug's petri dishes. You'd see these very small things moving around in the dish. Now, what is going on inside the Xenobot? That's a whole other set of questions that we don't have good answers to yet. So if you consider a small clump of frog cells that moves around in the dish, if you want to consider that intelligence, that is your own personal decision to make. It's not a scientific question. It's a question of belief. You mentioned panpsychism. So if you're a panpsychic, you might say that those cells have consciousness and they are deciding to work together to cooperate and move this clump of tissue together. It's a matter, I think, for philosophy at that point, not for science. If I can back up for a moment, you were also asking questions about what's going on inside the virtual world, how this evolutionary algorithm is actually dreaming up the idea for Xenobots. So let me walk you and your audience through that process. What we do is we start by, in code, telling the evolutionary algorithm what the building blocks are that it can play with. In this case, we tell the evolutionary algorithm there's two different types of Lego bricks, Lego A and Lego B. What the evolutionary algorithm does not know is that A is frog skin cells and B is frog heart muscle cells. We tell the computer that these two types of Lego bricks have different properties. Lego bricks A are soft. They can be pulled and pushed in the same way that your own skin is soft and passive. We tell the evolutionary algorithm that Lego brick B, if you build with these bricks will get bigger and smaller on their own. They're pistons or pumps. So the evolutionary algorithm doesn't know anything about frogs, doesn't know anything about skin or hearts. It just knows that it can build things. It knows that it can build anything from these two types of bricks. It can use as many A bricks and B bricks as it wants. What we tell the evolutionary algorithm is find a way of putting these bricks together so that that clump of bricks moves forward in the petri dish as quickly as possible. If you were to watch the evolutionary algorithm at work in the physics engine, what you'd see is that 99.999% of the clumps it makes, they don't move at all. The computer deletes all of those, but every once in a while it finds something that moves a little bit, evolves it further, it moves faster, 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 and at the end, it gives us back a blueprint. It says, put 118 A bricks here, put 397 B bricks here, and trust me, if you do that in reality, it'll start moving.
Are you experimenting with different animals? Why just frog? And what are its capabilities? Because the news which caught my attention was that it can reproduce. What are its capabilities, current capabilities, and what could be its capabilities and applications?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so let's start with what Xenobots currently can do, and then we can talk about what they might do in future. So what I just described to you was the first Xenobot experiment. We carried that out in January 2020. So in that case, 2 years ago, it was using heart muscle tissue to get the Xenobot to move along the bottom of the Petri dish. It basically walked. We published a second paper about the Xenobots in March 2021. In that case, we showed that you can actually just use skin cells, and under the right conditions, those skin cells will grow very, very small hairs on the cell's surface. These hairs are called cilia, C-I-L-I-A. And these cilia are like flexible oars. They will beat against the water. And if a clump of frog cells grows enough hairs, enough cilia on its outer surface, those hairs will all start to beat and the Xenobot will start to swim through the water. So January 2020, we made walking Xenobots. March 2021, we made swimming Xenobots. And then in December, last month, as you just mentioned, we published our third paper where we showed the Xenobots can replicate. So let me describe this capability to you. What Doug did in this case was to he made 9 different Xenobots, and he put that swarm of Xenobots together in the dish, and those 9 Xenobots starts moving around. Doug also sprinkled individual frog skin cells into the dish. So on the floor of the dish are a bunch of individual cells on their own. And those 9 moving Xenobots act like bulldozers. They start pushing the cells into clumps, into little piles. And what we learned in this experiment is if a pile collects and has more than 50 skin cells in it, those 50 skin cells are sticky, they'll stick together. And over a couple of days, that pile of cells will start to grow these small hairs, the cilia, on their outer surface. And after about 5 days, that pile will start moving on its own, and that pile becomes a child Xenobot. If we take those moving piles and put them in a new dish with new cells, they'll make new piles, and those new piles will start to move, which are grandchild Xenobots. And the swarm is able to replicate itself in this way.
Wow. When you doing things like this, do you kind of question what life is, if things are evolving like that?
That is a fantastic question. I'm not a biologist. I'm a roboticist, and I've worked in robotics and AI for a long time. And one of the things I like most about robotics and AI, and now Xenobots, is they challenge us. They challenge our preconceptions about what intelligence actually is. In the case of the Xenobots, as you mentioned, in some ways they challenge our understanding of what life is. I already mentioned one of these preconceptions. Frog DNA encodes frogs. It turns out that preconception was wrong. So all of these technologies and a lot of these biotechnologies that are emerging, they are causing us to reconsider or rethink what intelligence is and what life is. And I don't think anybody has a good answer to those old questions, but the old answers are clearly wrong. We're going to need to create new answers, and hopefully some young members of your audience will join the adventure to try and find new answers to those old questions.
For the longest time, we have been extremely structured, traditional, and we have been scared to ask deeper questions. But there is a convergence of things, because at least from my perspective, I see that it's not one technology like you into computational information, but then you are collaborating with the biologist, and the same thing is happening with augmented reality, virtual reality. There's a convergence with blockchain to create a decentralized metaverse. There's 5G, there is IoT, there is AI, and all of these, I think when it comes together, we'll be forced to ask deeper questions. And I guess we need to, push the future generation to be open and not rigid, because I think the society, the politics, the religion, and everything is kind of forced us to accept what the things are. But now I think we need to ask these really, really deep questions. You didn't touch the applications. I mean, when this matures, what could be the applications of this, and do touch also on the threats. What could be the possible threats of Xenobots?
Sure. I wanted to say I agree with you 100%, Eddie. I think there's so many exciting things happening in technology and science in general, and even in our society as a whole. We all of our societies came from more rigidly structured society. There's religion over here, there's politics over here, there's education here, there's science over here. But we are clearly maturing, and these clear boundaries are starting to dissipate, to disappear. It's a little scary. It's also very exciting. I don't think anybody really has a good idea or a good guess of where things should go, but I think I'm optimistic. By getting rid of some of these boundaries, it gives us more freedom to move around, to ask new kinds of questions, to bring seemingly different ideas together and see what happens. That's part of why I do what I do. I think it's extremely exciting. The hope is, of course, that it produces useful technologies in the case of robotics and Xenobots. So you asked about applications. As I mentioned, Xenobots are a brand new technology. They're less than 2 years old. So it's very, very difficult to say what the applications are. It's kind of like the birth of computers, during the Second World War. If you asked the pioneers of the computer age in the 1940s and 1950s about what the applications of computers would be, I don't think they would have said Google Maps or Tinder or whatever the crazy current, or Instagram. It's impossible to guess what the killer app will be for a technology. However, in the case of the Xenobots in particular, they have very interesting differences from traditional robots. And the main difference is that they are robots built completely from genetically unmodified biological tissue. So that already suggests possible applications for the future. They are biodegradable and they are biocompatible. So it may be possible in the not too distant future to create Xenobots that do underwater inspection tasks. So for example, you could imagine Xenobots that enter a wastewater treatment facility and move around and take sensor readings. You could imagine Xenobots finding and collecting microplastics, very, very small pieces of plastics in our rivers and oceans. They could enter the soil to find pollutants and either remove those pollutants or send up a signal that there's pollution at this particular place. Again, because they're biodegradable and they're genetically unmodified, I think they're a safer technology than some of the other technologies that are out there. Moving forward in time, it may become possible to build biobots from cells taken from other species other than frogs. And you can probably guess one of the potential targets would be humans themselves. It may become possible in the future to build biobots from human cells. And that would open the way towards starting to study medical applications. Many, many years from now, you might be able to actually build a biobot from your own cells, swallow that biobot, and have it do useful work inside the human body. And because it's made from your own cells, it wouldn't trigger your immune response. The body is very good at detecting non-self stuff and trying to destroy it.
So would you like to touch upon the threats? What if it starts reproducing inside the body? What I mean, I'm just going, but what are the possible negatives to something like this? Because this could also become intelligent, so.
Yes, so that's a really good question. And this is very, very important, especially with brand new technologies like the Xenobots. It's important to think about the negative potentials. I just wanted to say we are definitely not planning to release Xenobots into the ocean or the human body anytime soon. Those would be sort of the very last applications. We need to understand these technologies better. I described to you that they replicate. It turns out that it's really, really, really hard to get them to replicate. So the AI, which designs the replicating Xenobots, it had to think for a month on a supercomputer to come up with a design that replicates for 5 generations. So the AI-generated Xenobots produce great-great-great-great-grandchildren, but then those great-great-great-grandchildren do not produce children of their own. The process halts. It comes to a stop. So Hollywood has had a lot of fun with quote-unquote educating us that if you ever make a self-replicating machine, it will instantly spread over the planet and it's game over for humans. It turns out in reality that that's not the case. We live on a planet with billions and billions of species that self-replicate. And sometimes some of them replicate a little more than we would like the case of the COVID virus. But we coexist. There is no one species that suddenly self-replicates and wipes out every other species on the planet. If it did, that would obviously be game over for everyone. Life simply doesn't work that way. However, there is still not necessarily a threat, but we need to understand this technology. So the current application of Xenobots are actually scientific applications. We can use the Xenobots in a safe laboratory setting where they are covered by very strict animal welfare laws here in the United States. And we can use that very safe system to learn more about the conditions under which life doesn't replicate and does replicate. And I think there may be things that we learn about Xenobots that might help us in our current battles against other species that replicate more than we would like. Right. You were just mentioning how our world is becoming increasingly interconnected. That allows biological viruses, computer viruses to spread more quickly and more widely. Humans, we don't have a good sense of how to control or organize things in a world like that. And I think the Xenobots are a tool that's going to help us understand the world that we now all live in.
Right. So is there any current updates that you would like to share, and what's the future roadmap for developing this Xenobot into something useful for society and everyone?
Yeah, so I'm not allowed to say too many details about what we're currently working on, but I can give you some general ideas. I walked you through how Xenobots are currently created. It's a 2-step process. We evolve Xenobots in simulation, and then we build them under the microscope by hand. I mentioned Doug Blackistone, who's our extremely talented microsurgeon. So Doug looks through a microscope and almost cell by cell builds up a single millimeter-sized Xenobot. And it takes Doug about 4 hours to make one Xenobot. So this is a very slow manual manufacturing process. We are in the process of looking at ways to manufacture Xenobots automatically. So we can manufacture millions or billions of them. In my group, we are then building AI that can watch and observe those billions of manufactured Xenobots to learn which ones worked and which ones didn't work, collect that new biological knowledge, and put that new biological knowledge back into the evolutionary algorithm so that the next time the evolutionary algorithm evolves Xenobots, they're more useful, they're safer, they transfer better from the virtual petri dish into the physical petri dish, and so on.
My last question, your
Sure.
views on artificial general intelligence. Do you think we're gonna get there, and what could be the possible roadmap for artificial general intelligence?
Yeah, great question. So yeah, AGI is always a fun topic to talk about. Personally, I believe in it. And if you flip it around, the argument becomes humans will never create AGI ever. And if there's something I've learned about science and engineering in general is never say never. It would be very hard to prove that we can never do something. So I think AGI is possible. If I've learned anything from robots and Xenobots is when AGI finally arrives, it will not look anything like what Hollywood thinks it will look like or what we think it will look like. I don't think anybody expected the Xenobots, including us. You mentioned human-computer interaction, virtual reality, augmented reality. Hollywood has taught us that, AGI is, when it arises, it's going to be them. It's going to be us, the humans, against them. I think that's simplistic thinking. Technology is no longer separate from us. We hold our phones all the time. We are getting closer to being able to plug technology directly into our bodies or our brains. I think if and when AGI arrives, it will be a mixture of us and technology. There will be no clear dividing line between us and them. But again, that's just my personal opinion. It'll be interesting to see what happens.
Thank you. And yeah, maybe I endorse whatever you say, because the lines are getting blurred. We were carrying technology so far, phones and computers, but eventually I think we'll be wearing technology. We'll get implanted the way the future is. And there's some really, really exciting things happening. You and your team at the Tufts Laboratory are creating the building blocks of what could be life 2.0. So wish you and the team the very best. And to my listeners, if you like what you see in here, then please press the subscribe button. And until next time, see you guys. Thank you, Doctor. Really appreciate this.
Thank you so much, Eddie.